Welcome to How Good's Innovation Online series. I'm not sure, we've been doing these for more than a year now, since the pandemic pushed us all online, which has allowed this huge number of people from all over the world to join us. So thank you for being here for How Good's Innovation Online series. Today, we're talking about regenerative product incubation and acceleration with Danielle Gould. Danielle is the co-founder and co-CEO at Alpha Food Labs and also the founder and CEO at Food+Tech Connect. We're doing some introductions. We will dive into about a 35-minute conversation to start. Danielle and I digging in on regenerative product incubation and acceleration. There'll be an interactive community breakout where you'll get into a room with a couple other people, get to say hello, chat with them, learn a little bit about what they're up to and what they're excited about, and then come back together for Q&A at the end. One last thing I want to point your attention to is going forward. This is the last one in this mini series on product innovation. But then there's a new series that's actually an invite-only working group of folks who want to keep doing this sort of work, who want to look at how do we innovate our products for positive impact. So this is starting summer 2021. There's a number of awesome guest speakers lined up, and there will also be interactive work with some of the tools that How Good has on offer to support the development of really top-notch products. If you would like an invitation and have not received one, then please shoot Kate a note. That's kate@howgood.com, and we will get you an invite to this group. Also, just another little plug for what's coming up. We're finishing this product-focused mini-series, but the innovation talks and thought leader conversations are going to continue. Next up, we're going to do suppliers, especially suppliers that have made commitments to or are heading towards regenerative agriculture. So we've just confirmed some folks from Cargill as one of the speakers. We're going to have the large scale, we're going to have the tiny, really excellent small scale regenerative agriculture folks. That's the supplier series, which will launch later this summer. Okay, thanks again for being here. I am going to welcome Danielle and get us started. Thanks, Danielle, for being here. And maybe you could just, kick us off with what's new, what's fresh at Alpha Food Labs, what's fresh and new at Food+Tech Connect. Maybe you could tell us what each of those are. Go for it.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me, Ethan, and hello to everyone. It's nice to see so many friendly faces. So Alpha Food Labs, we are a design consultancy. We do product development and innovation strategy, primarily with larger food companies, creating a food future that's better for people and the planet. At Food+Tech Connect, we're a community for food innovation. We're best known for our newsletter that tracks all the business, tech, and investment trends in food. And for both companies, we're working on some fun stuff. So at Alpha Food Labs, we've been doing a deep dive into regeneration and biodiversity for the last couple of years. Starting last year, we've been working with Beef and Lamb New Zealand Wine. So we did a market scan report on the current zeitgeist around and future potential for regenerative agriculture in the US, UK, and Germany. And we also did a consumer insights report, and we are just wrapping that up, and hopefully we'll be able to share some of that. We found some really interesting findings on the communication side and what some of the barriers are, which I know we'll get into today, into scaling regenerative agriculture. We're working with Danone right now on some really exciting work around imagining the future, doing some scenario planning and helping them think about how to create an innovation sandbox to do more longer term innovation work. And that also has led us down the regeneration path and really getting more into regenerative business models, which I know we'll talk about. And what does regenerative product development look like? On the Food+Tech Connect side, it's been really fun. We've been, we used to convene people in person. We would do these monthly events where we would do a deep dive into a different area of food innovation. And with COVID, obviously we couldn't convene people in person. So we've been trying out a lot of different formats. We have partnered with Ag Funder. We're doing a lot of stuff on Clubhouse right now, which is available on Android. So join us. We have the show Future Food News Review that we do, where we get leading journalists together to do a deep dive into the the top headlines for a nuanced conversation about the top headlines across the whole, all of food from farm to fork. And we're getting ready hopefully in September, we're going to do a planet positive food series where we dig into all aspects of what is planet positive food, from the business models to the science, the technology. So stay tuned for that. Anyone who wants to get involved, reach out.
All right, thank you. Yeah. So let's go I'm taking back to what you're talking about, the future of plant-based food and your work with Danone. So what is regenerative product incubation and acceleration? And how are you thinking about that as different from just product innovation?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a term that you guys created, I guess, and I like it. I think we are thinking much more holistically about, so for example, within the context of plant-based, as an example, right? So you have a lot of companies that are going after single ingredients, right? Single plant-based ingredients and scaling those up. So, pea or oat. And the way that we're approaching it is, how do we scale systems? And not just systems, but how do we think about what does a truly regenerative company look like? What is every part of the business has to be regenerative, right? Not just the supply chain. And so, I mean, that's the innovation that I'm most excited about. I think we're in this really unique time, with COVID and what happened to our supply chains, right? When we saw people, I think it was kind of the breakdown of our food system and our food industry, and we're seeing it now even with labor, with restaurants. So I think that there's this, in order to build in resilience, there's this new imperative to kind of rethink models. And so the work that we're doing with Danone is really exciting because we're investigating what, on every single level, what does it mean to be a diverse, regenerative, biodiverse company? And we're starting to see some smaller companies that are thinking about that as well, which I know we'll dig in deeper.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because basically what you said is you can't just have a regenerative product. You can't just innovate or incubate a regenerative product. You can only incubate a regenerative product within the context of a regenerative business. And so it quickly takes you, when you're thinking about a product in that way, beyond just what is in the supply system, who am I buying? It's not just did you do a regen ag thing where you were growing this? It's what is the whole process even of contracting, of finding and creating the product within that larger system of the company that makes it regenerative.
Exactly. And then who's at the table designing it, right? And who are you designing for? I mean, there's this fallacy, when we think about product design, and, all of the work that we do is very eater centric, right? It's very consumer centric. But really, you need to have empathy for so much more than the consumer. The consumer isn't always right, and oftentimes we're actually we need to be designing for the planet. We need to be designing for local communities, and so I think that is a mindset it requires a lot of different paradigm shifts and mindset shifts to design for something that's a much more holistic, systems-driven product. And then the capital structure. And I'm just at the beginning of this journey. I'm really fascinated. I think this is something that we're excited about with the Planet Positive Food Series, where we're going to start to have more public conversations around this. But, corporate governance, within the context of Danone, I mean, everyone's seen what's happened with Danone, where Emmanuel Faber was one of the more ambitious CEOs out there in the food world, and he got pushed out. So what does it look like to be an ambitious, regenerative CEO, right? And where is your capital coming from? Who are your shareholders? How do you distribute value across the entire organization much more equitably versus just making the executive team and your investors wealthy, right? What does that look like? And I think we're seeing, I mean, I'm having conversations with a lot of finance people, and, even Ray Dalio talks about this, that the companies will fail if people are starting to revolt. It's what's happening in the restaurant industry right now, and for those people who haven't been following this, there are fast food chains, there is no labor. People do not want to go back to work in these for low wages and in often kind of deplorable conditions. And I think that's going to be, that's going to happen across every industry. And so companies are really going to have to rethink, to be a resilient company, to be able to succeed into the future, you're going to have to rethink how you think about who your stakeholders are and how you distribute value across the company.
Yeah, and how you make decisions in general. And you'll have to hold that big scale governance, finance, capital structure while still maintaining a pace of innovation that, to my understanding, is faster in food than it's ever been before. And so I'm curious to hear, to bring it down to a tangible level. What are some of the cool products that you've seen and sort of incubated or accelerated that you think are maybe they haven't achieved the full vision of what you just laid out, but are sort of like moving in that direction towards a regenerative product?
Yeah, so I mean, we've worked on some cool products, but nothing, and they're in the spirit of what I'm talking about, but really within the last year, like it never occurred to me. I was really thinking about supply chain, like we have this product. So we have this brand that we've been working on internally for ourselves called Varietal. And the idea was to introduce people to the deliciousness of all of the varietals, all of the diverse foods that are out there. And we started with this, it's called a crop cracker. So a cracker that's based on crop rotation. So we would work within a region with the farmers within that region, and each SKU would be a different rotation. And it's very similar. I mean, Moonshot Snacks is actually doing a lot of this right now. They're actually working with some of the farmers that we were looking to work with. And they're doing amazing work. But we were still looking at old ways of financing the business. I mean, we were still looking at it. We were still looking at old models of production and, like going to a co-packer to manufacture, going through retail, going through brokers, through all that. And we were looking at VC money, right? And I don't know that that's compatible necessarily with, and so I don't, as far as like from a product perspective, I'm actually glad that we didn't bring it to market yet, because I don't want to put anything out into the world. I feel like there's so much more to learn and what is the responsible way to bring a company to market. And I'm just not there on that journey yet. But I'm doing that work, right? I'm very grateful to be doing the work with Danone right now to better understand that. And I think a lot of people are in a place where they're trying to understand those models. So I think that there are some really cool models that are happening right now that are not necessarily like what you would think about. So I think Fibershed, and Ethan, you and I have talked with Rebecca Burgess, quite a bit. Fibershed, they are building out, they're an organization, it's a for-profit and nonprofit, and they're creating regenerative fiber sheds. So what does that mean? They are regionally across the country, they are creating their opportunities to create regenerative fibers. And that takes a lot of different things in order to do that. So one is they are connecting farmers to brands. They're creating pre-competitive relationships between multiple brands in order to make long-term commitments and get the volumes that they need to commit to those farmers in order to develop that like wool, for example. They are investing in local mills and brokering relationships with local mills. Right now they're leveraging some existing infrastructure, but they're investing in and bringing on more capital to invest in the development of more regional mills. They're also doing a bunch of research, and they have certification. So I think that like that model is really cool, and they're working with some of my favorite brands. They're working with like Mara Hoffman, for example, and some other fashion brands. So I think that's a cool model. Yesterday, I had the absolute pleasure to go and visit Greenwave. And Greenwave is doing also some really rad stuff where their goal is, so they are seaweed and they're ocean farmers. They're trying to create this regenerative ocean economy. And they want to, in the next 10 years, train 10,000 ocean farmers. And what they're doing is, so they are a nonprofit, but they are they have this 4-point model where they create market relationships. So they're doing market development for their farmers, and they're thinking about various ways that they can monetize the whole plant, and like through all those things, they're able to get to about $2 a pound per plant per planet harvest. They are helping the farmers monetize the data that they're collecting. So their buoys are collecting all this data, which they're selling to insurance providers. And then they're also going to be monetizing ecosystem services. So they're thinking about how to diversify. They're working with indigenous farmers as well. They're in 7 states around the country. What else are they doing? Oh, and then they are partnering with the Crop Project. Casey Emmett, who used to be at Health Warrior, he's launched a processing company that is working with them directly to process it, which is the linchpin for this, because it's very easy to grow the kelp, but it's very fickle. And so you need someone who's able to process it. So, and they're thinking about farmer cooperatives. They're thinking about how to diversify revenue streams so that even if, like in Hurricane Sandy, for example, their whole, crop was destroyed, but if they could still be collecting data and doing ecosystems work, that they're just diversifying their income streams. So those are a couple of the examples of companies that I think are doing really innovative things. They're thinking about how to support the entire system, and they're thinking about, from a capital perspective, from a community perspective, empowering people across the whole value chain. And yeah, I'm really excited to see. And they're thinking about blended capital models, which I think is also critical.
Yeah, and there's some really key themes that we've also seen in tracking sort of like folks moving towards regenerative products who are out there. So the theme of processing and actually getting the processing of the raw goods closer to origin. So whether that's Soul Simple, who's doing that in Latin America, producing regenerative tropical fruits and then drying them and getting them to market both as individual products and then also as a wholesale supplier. And then Chef Pierre Thiam from Yolele, who we've had on the show a couple times, is doing something similar, working towards at-origin processing for the fonio grains that he's working with smallholder farmers in West Africa to produce. And then adding on this layer of the payment for ecosystem services, I think we'll see a lot more of in the coming years. So our colleagues over at Regen Network just raised $11 million to do this and are already basically selling different ecosystem service credits into the marketplace so that farmers who are moving towards regeneration can also capture that value stream while they're producing these high quality and amazing products. So I think there are a number of themes that we're sort of like moving in that direction. I'm curious, Danielle, if you've seen anything in the realm of looking at sort of what CPGs are doing versus what restaurants are doing. You spoke a little bit about the restaurant industry, but how do you see product incubation, product innovation happening, or recipe innovation, and what's the difference between what's happening sort of in the food side of things in restaurants and at the CPG and sort of product manufacturing side?
Yeah, so I mean, I think because of COVID, you have seen a lot of restaurants that are starting to get into the CPG space, which I think is so exciting because, anyone who's been, we need more deliciousness in our CPG products for sure, more culinary innovation. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier, but I'm really big on ghost kitchens right now, and I know that there's a lot of issues around ghost kitchens because they kind of obscure, there's not a lot of transparency. But what you've seen over the pandemic is this just explosion of ghost kitchens, right? And the opportunity to start a virtual restaurant very quickly and then leverage, and you can turn it on and off, and you can change it, as you get to find product market fit, and then you can leverage delivery in order to get to eaters really quickly. And so Nugs is a great example of a CPG company that leveraged ghost kitchens in order to test their products. So nugs, they have these plant-based nuggets, and they didn't have a retail or food service presence. And so they turned to ghost kitchens as a way to get their products into customers' hands during the pandemic. And they leverage like delivery apps like Uber Eats as a quick way they would test things. They would do their product development in the ghost kitchen, and then they would just put their menu out there, and they would immediately get feedback from people, right, and build brand awareness. And so, like, one of the problems with regenerative ag and regenerative food is that there's not a lot of manufacturing and processing capacity, right? Like that is at every part of regenerative food systems, whether you're in the oceans, whether you're on land, that's a huge issue. And so being able to do it at food service scale is so much easier, as you're also just trying to test new ingredients out, right? And how you do your storytelling. And so I think that there's a real opportunity to leverage ghost kitchens to do some of the processing and product development and market testing of more regenerative products. And I'm pushing it big. And I was like, I mean, Nugs did it. They had huge success, found their product market fit, were able to innovate really quickly, and now they're going into retail, right? And they also have a food service component where that they can still have turned on. So I think that there is going to be a lot there. And I think we've assumed that CPG has to happen in a certain way, right? We've assumed that, but I think that the structure of CPG today is just so limiting. And so, as more people have their own D2C channels, as delivery has exploded, I just think we have to think more broadly. And until you're ready to invest in the CapEx needed for some of this processing and manufacturing infrastructure, how can we leverage food service to test things out more quickly?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's almost like you're thinking of ghost kitchens sort of like cloud servers, and how that sort of revolutionized. You don't have to have a whole bunch of mainframes in one place. You can just hire a cloud server from somebody else. You're sort of saying, rather than have to build up all your own innovation, production, creativity, you can work with those who are really good at it and then use that as your testing ground. Awesome. So there's a bunch of questions coming in the chat around certifications. So let's dig in a little on certifications, Danielle. Maybe I'll kick it off a bit just with some of the basic info of what's out there, and then we can both talk about the realm and sort of what's next for certifications. Okay, so there are 4 that I know of, quote unquote, regenerative certifications that are out there. One of them is Regenerative Organic Certification that was put out by the Regenerative Organic Alliance with some stalwarts like Rodale, Patagonia, Dr. Bronner's, and others who've sort of pushed this one forward. That's basically an organic plus some other things certification. There's also the best in class that's currently out there on the market from my perspective is the Savory Ecological Outcomes Verification. It's called Land to Market. This is the only one that's currently out there that is outcomes-based, not practices-based. And this is a key component that I think is incredibly important for anything that's claiming regenerative, is you can't just say, oh, well, I did cover crops and I did a little bit of compost and I did no-till, so now I'm regenerative, right? You can't do it based on practices. There's no such thing as regenerative practices. You have to track the outcomes. So those are the 2 that are currently out there and working. There's 2 more on the way. One is from the Soil Carbon Initiative from Green America that's already have a standard, but is maybe moving towards a certification, we've heard. That will also be outcomes-based, but purely focused on soil. And then there's another one from A Greener World that I haven't heard a lot of exactly what it's going to look like yet. Those are all supply system focused. They're looking at production. There are not currently any certifications that even claim to be regenerative for a company or a product innovation cycle, nor do I think there should be. And I'd love to hear Danielle's thoughts on this, but I think, there's some that have tried to move in this direction, but I think have not achieved it. B Corp, a notable one. Regenerative is above and beyond just an idea of doing good. There is an organization out there that's done a regenerative business prize a few times and has a very, very good rubric for what it would actually take to become a regenerative business. And you can look at some of the past honorees in that prize. Some really interesting stuff that's happened. That's coming from the Regenerative Paradigm Institute and Carol Sanford. But there's other thinking out there. So that's my initial take on certifications. Ultimately, I'm not into certifications. I think we can do better. I think we can go beyond them. But I do recognize them as a part of the current system that we should learn well and learn which ones are sort of going further than others. Danielle, over to you for your thoughts on certifications in that landscape.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything that you said. I think the thing about regeneration is that it's a continuum. Like, you've never achieved regeneration, right? And so that's part of the challenge with ROC, is that it's practice-based, right? And that alienates a lot of farmers. And farmers tend to really prefer the Savory Institutes, and where it's outcomes based. And I tend to agree with that. I think that that is part of, like, we should be measuring outcomes in the continuum of progress toward outcomes. I think that Savory right now feels like the most established, and it's kind of the gold standard. It's the most widely adopted. And the most well-funded. And they have just such a large footprint and a large network globally. They have hubs in, I don't know how many countries, but hubs in countries around the world. They're doing farmer training. It's a very robust system. I think to the question, Sharon asked a question about, whether this is just the production side. And I think that is one of the things, there is no definition, one singular definition of what regenerative is. And I advocate I think regenerative is a beautiful word and concept if you think about it when applied holistically, when you think about regenerating every part of a system. But a lot of people don't think like that. You have, certain companies that are coming out saying we want to be a regenerative company, right? Like certain big companies, and they're kind of empty words. There's not a lot of explanation. And it's a little bit greenwash. There's a lot of greenwashing out there. I would say that with Savory, they're very focused on soil. They're not talking about marine regeneration, like regenerating our oceans or anything like that. And they're definitely not they're not measuring impacts to community and some of the bigger components that are a key part of, like, it's not taking into account what a regenerative business is. So I don't know that a certification needs to do that, but I would say that it's a little bit fraught. But I do think I agree with you that Savory seems to be the leading.
Yeah, and at the same time, the regenerative organic certification does take into account labor practices and fair labor, which is and is the only one of those that does it so far. And I think Danielle and I would both agree that whether you certify it or not, and whether it's just the product level or the whole company, we need to move in a more holistic direction where human beings, social, cultural, culinary, spiritual life even should be considered in the bigger framework that what we're heading towards, which is part of why you can't just say, check, 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 I'm done. This is a regenerative product. Let's keep going. Can I just make a marketing claim on this now and make some more money? It's not about that. This is a long journey that hopefully we're all going to be on together in the coming years. And in some ways, the big players coming in, Cargill said, we're going to do 10 million acres in regenerative ag. Pepsi came in and said, we're going to do 7 million acres in regenerative ag. General Mills did it a couple of years back. They were the first to say, we're going to do 1 million acres. So there's a significant push to say, let's go in this direction. And so I think part of our work is how do we uphold the integrity, the completeness, the holisticness of this, while supporting more and more people and more farmers to move in this direction. Regenerative is certainly growing faster with farmers than organic did.
Yes.
And it has something to do with the outcomes-based nature of it. It has something to do with the message of it. It's not like, let's do less bad. It's like, let's actually do good for the world. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And the challenge becomes, how do we uphold the integrity? What are you seeing, just back to ingredients, Danielle, what are you seeing in terms of ingredients that are sort of working in this direction, or the ingredients that people are most trying to say, hey, I'm doing this regeneratively? What are some of the trends, for product development that you're seeing out there in terms of, maybe it's on biodiversity, or, yeah, I'd love to hear what you're seeing in this space.
I mean, people are very focused on oats right now and grains. Different grains and oats. I think there is some thinking around almonds also, like how do we think regeneratively? You're starting to see in the wine industry a little bit more conversation. Obviously, when you're talking about beef, like grass-fed cattle, yeah, I think those are kind of some of the ingredients. I mean, that's very US centric. But I think that those are some of the major things that people are thinking about.
Awesome. Okay, so in just a minute, I'm gonna do one more question and then we're gonna do a quick breakout. But I'd love to hear what you think, like those are some of the ingredients you're starting to see that people are moving on, but where do you want to see more? Like what types of products, and you could take that as ingredients, but you could also take that as categories of products. What do you want to see more of that you think would take us in this more regenerative direction?
Yeah, so I want to see more companies scaling systems. I think that there are, there's been a lot of investment, there's unprecedented investment into the plant-based world. And most companies are, honestly, they're scaling individual ingredients that are, if they become billion-dollar companies, they're just, replacing soy with peas or almonds or, cashews. And, they are often crops that could be grown in rotation that could have amazing benefits, right? So I'd love to see, more legumes, which are great, and things that are grown in scaling systems. There's a company, Willycroft, that I heard an interview that Cohen did with them. And I loved, they're a plant-based cheese company and they're based in Amsterdam, and they completely, he wanted to do this plant-based cheese to be a, climate beneficial cheese, and dug into the supply chain and realized that actually the, the cashews that they were using were actually really like not very climate friendly. And so they took the product off the market and completely reformulated it. And they're now working on a fully regenerative cheese. They're not even able to get there right now. They're having trouble establishing the supply chain. But that's an example of I would just like to see more companies thinking more ambitiously about that. And you have a lot of companies who are raising a lot of money, and I've talked with GFI, for example, right, about all the Good Food Institute. And, they said, well, they've said these companies, first we have to go after market share. And now that we have market share, we can start to think about supply chain. And I just think that that is a false premise. I think that we have to build together the supply chain, right? And so that's what I'd like to see more of.
I want to go to Avi's question first. I hope I'm saying your name right. And for Danielle, I'd also love to put in some thoughts here after Danielle on this one. But there's this amazing article that if you haven't read, you should read. That's called Regenerative Agriculture, basically needs a reckoning. And so the question here is, how do we attribute ownership to allow the indigenous Black originators of regenerative agroecological practices to participate in value sharing, yeah, or even further than that, or just how do we give all the land back so that they can keep doing what they were doing before we fucked it all up. But yeah, Danielle, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that side of things.
Yeah, Avi, thank you so much for bringing up this point. And anyone who hasn't read this article or this piece that Joe wrote, it's phenomenal, and I can't recommend it enough. I This is such an important point, and it's central to the report that we did on regenerative agriculture. I think we need land reparations, and I think that we need to be, and that's where I know there was a question that Ethan was going to ask about if I had $1 billion, and I think a lot of that would go into land reparations and infrastructure development. I think we need to be giving attribution. Like, I think we need to talk about, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, I think we need to talk about the history of these agricultural practices. And I also think that we need to have representation in companies. Like, if I were starting a food company right now, I would want to have Black and Indigenous peoples who are co-founders, who are on the executive team, who are advisors, who are investors, who are like, I think we need to do all of the above. And we need to not whitewash this. And there's no, I think that one of the problems in the innovation space is there's this techno optimism, techno saviorism, like entrepreneurial saviorism, like I'm saving the world. And I think that's really dangerous, because I actually think that we're replicating, the Green Revolution, but it's just couched in, VC money and younger companies, right? That have this halo effect of, we're saving the planet, and those are the same arguments, right? And it's very whitewashed. So I think we need to be giving money, I think land back, and all the other things I said. Ethan, what about you?
There's so many things. I mean, to start, I should say, we didn't acknowledge here the land that we're sitting on. I'm here on Waranatwankong, Lenape land, unceded land. There's so many organizations right now that are Indigenous and BIPOC led that are doing great work in this space, that we should be thinking about not just allowing them, but backing them, funding them, supporting their leadership in this realm is really huge and important. So I think supporting the existing organizations that are out there is great. I've been thinking a lot as a small landholder here. I've been thinking about how do I start and move along that process of reparations. My wife works for an organization called Seed Shed that's doing amazing seed rematriation, seed justice work that is also figuring out how to have long-term relationships with Indigenous communities and support them to have their seed sovereignty again. And one thing that I heard recently, and I believe this came through Leah and the folks at Soulfire Farm, another great organization to back and support, is their work on doing a voluntary land tax. So sometimes just saying, hey, here's land back, take this back, that can actually not go well. And that without a long series of relationship built up, that can be too fast and too much. And, sometimes like damaging rain on a difficult barren landscape. The 7 or 8 steps that are laid out by the Decolonizing Wealth organization are a great set, where reparations is actually the last step in the process. There's first acknowledging and grieving, and like there's a long process before you're like, okay, here's the land back. So one small thing that I've been thinking is, let's just start this voluntary land tax, where I take whatever it is, whatever my county, state, school taxes are, I'm going to volunteer to send that money to the tribes, to the peoples who were on this land where I'm currently living and quote unquote holding or owning land. And if you think about everybody living here, that would be a huge financial contribution towards the people who are, leading in their own way. So I think there's some important stuff there. There's one other little piece that I want to name, which is that from some of the Indigenous leaders who have been on this show, from Reginaldo to Michael Kotatua Johnson, one of the things that they've named is that We don't also necessarily want to push regenerative agriculture onto them, and because they don't necessarily, different tribes don't necessarily use that term. They're not necessarily saying, well, we came up with regenerative agriculture. They don't call it, they call it the way we've lived for thousands of years. And so I want to just sort of own and acknowledge that each indigenous peoples in each place, including our own indigenous ancestors, wherever they're from, had their own unique way and life way to integrate with the land and create amazing biodiversity, cultural diversity, culinary diversity. And so I think noting that there are many lineages and not just one is an important part. And then, as Avi started with, acknowledging and supporting the folks who did develop incredible ecosystems wherever they were is a really important part of the process, but it's not the end. We each have a lot farther to go on this. Mm-hmm. Okay, that was a lot. Next, on to the next, and thanks. I love it when there's so much happening in the chat. I can't follow along. That's great. There was another question here from Cam. To what degree extent is there known work towards transcending the current limits of certifications with verification technology currently existing and under development? Danielle, thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that there's a lot. I think there are a lot of technologies out there that are trying to measure, all the ecosystem service benefits. But at the same time, it's kind of a catch-22, because when eaters are kind of looking for, from what we found, the certification helps, right? They're not scanning a label to say, okay, you sequestered this much carbon, or, you helped to, clean the waterways or increase the bird population by this percentage point. Like they just need something really easy, like an easy certification helps them feel better and scan a product much more quickly. So there's that tension. But certainly a lot of people there are a ton of technologies that are in development right now and that are being piloted. But I think it's going to come down to how do you make it very easy and simple?
Yeah. There's so many, from soil probes that measure 27 things and beam it up into the cloud, to the work of open teams and their open agricultural ecosystem, to, like I've mentioned before, Regen Network and how they're modeling ecosystem services. There's a lot happening focused on outcomes, and I think it's great. But I also don't want to only leave it in the hands of the eaters and us to vote with our dollar and change things. That can work. It is important. It is useful. Yeah. We should do it. In the US, though, greenhouse gases are actually a much smaller percent from agriculture. It's only, it's down below 20%, as opposed to gas and construction and energy, which is a much larger percent. So yes, we have to vote with our dollar. But I also think that structural changes in the economics, in the financial and the capital system, as Danielle was speaking to, and with, sometimes companies come forward and say, oh, well, we haven't heard it from consumers, so we're not going to go that way. I think that's irresponsible, and that, everyone should be working in this direction.
Yeah, and what we're seeing is, you saw what happened with COVID. So I think that there's just an imperative from a resiliency perspective for companies to be rethinking their models and to be adopting more regenerative practices. I look at what's happened with the vaccine rollout, right? Like, food nationalism is going to be a thing, right? Like, COVID wasn't the first kind of global issue that we're going to be facing. This was just getting us all prepared for what's to come in the coming years. And if you look at the like Singapore, for example, they have Singapore 2030, right? Where they want to be able to grow 30% of their food within Singapore by 2030. And so they are investing heavily in cultured meat, and they are fast tracking approvals, right? So Just was able to sell their first cultured product, chicken in Singapore. They're investing quite a bit in greenhouse technology, those kind of things. And so I think that companies in the future are going to be having to develop regional supply chains, supply webs, um, supply systems in order to be resilient, whether it's, there are shocks because of climate change, because of another pandemic, because of, for a geopolitical perspective. And so I think every company is starting to think about that, right? They're starting to plan for things that they hadn't been planning for in the past. I mean, our conversations, whereas it was more altruistic in the past with our clients when we talked about it, and it was a hard sell, it's much less of a hard sell right now, these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, yeah. And I think just a little note there, you switched from saying supply chain to supply web or supply system. And this actually, in a way, connects back to Avi's question in the article we were discussing. Supply chains is still the dominant term that's used in the industry, but it's not really a great term to be using because it comes from the time, two things. It comes from the time when we actually used to put people in chains so that they would produce our sugar and our rum and our timber and other materials for us. And we've kind of held on to that. But then at the same time, it gets this image in our head of a machine that has a single straight line created by links in a chain. Natural systems don't work that way. Supply systems don't work that way. It is a more interconnected web. And so there's this subtle little thing where we all still say supply chains, even as we're attempting to regenerate them, but we're setting ourselves in a kind of mechanical mind to do it. If anyone's got any other questions, we've got time for a few more. I am going to ask you that $1 billion question. I'd love to hear your response on it. Specifically, if you had $1 billion to invest into regenerative food systems, what would you do with it? Who would you invest in? Where would you put it? Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So if I had $1 billion, like I said, I would be investing in land reparations and investing in, more underrepresented, underinvested communities, indigenous communities. I would be investing in modular processing and manufacturing infrastructure and in figuring out how to make it more modular. I would be investing in nutrient density research. So I think that that's going to be, it's kind of like a linchpin. If we can understand nutrient density, the nutrient density of regenerative foods, I think that is going to be something that, will get more people. It's a no-brainer to be growing our food this way. Other areas, long-term commitments to farmers, I would be investing in to really help invest in their the risk that they're taking on as they shift what they're growing. And then I would build out a blended capital fund. I think blended capital is the future. So I think there is a place for venture, but longer term horizon, evergreen funds, I think, there are different models with debt, mixing debt where appropriate.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, one last question here before we wrap up. The eternal question, says Julie. Wherever you've been that this is an eternal question is a lovely place. I'll just say that. And I think it's an awesome question. Is it better to get a crop that's not regenerative and make it regenerative, or to get the crop that is and always has been regenerative? So I have some thoughts on it. Maybe I'll just do it quick and then give it to Danielle for last words. So I don't think it's an either or. I think this should be a both and. I think in many cases, you'll see that perennial tree crops have a greater chance of having an ecosystem situation, capturing carbon in their biomass and in the soil, multi-layered permaculture, agroforestry, agroecological, indigenous traditions that have been in every part of the world from Ireland to the Amazon, to the Savannah, that everywhere has had something like this. So I think there's some great work to do there as long as we can be non-extractive as we do it. But I don't think that means that we should ignore the oats, rye, barley, monoculture, industrial. Like, we need to make progress on those two because a significant amount of calories still comes from there. I plant chestnuts on my farm for the long-term tree crops, but I also grow potatoes and corn, which I have, roots in my ancestry on both sides of growing. So I don't think it's an either or. Both are important to be working on. Yeah, Danielle, there you go. Wrap us up with that.
Yeah, with what? With
that last question there.
I mean, I would agree with everything that you said. I don't have
Yeah,
anything
no, I
else
was
to
going for
add.
the next one, the Planet Positive series.
Oh, the Planet Positive. Okay, so I'm just typing this in. Sign up for our newsletter. And I just put the link in the chat. Yeah, we'll be announcing it.
All right. Any last words for the crowd before we sign off, Danielle? Things you'd like to leave us with and send us out to do?
No, I mean, I would say thank you all so much for being here. It was really fun. I hope to, you'll join us. We're doing a lot of conversations, like I said, on Clubhouse, and we'll be launching this series in September. So, hope you'll join the newsletter and follow along, and feel free to reach out if you want to chat about anything. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. See you next time.